Hello and welcome to the panel, Securing the Hybrid and Remote Workforce. My name is Sean Atkinson. I'll be the host today. I am the CISO for the Center for Internet Security, home to the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, home to the CIS benchmarks, and the CIS critical security controls. What I'd like to do is have each of our panelists introduce themselves. Paul.
My name is Paul Bruno. I'm the head of Threat Intelligence Advisory at Rapid7 via last year's acquisition of the threat intelligence startup Insights. I represent the company at events like this, providing some perspective on threat intelligence issues, also doing white papers and research for customers.
Thank you, Paul. Gavin.
Hi, I'm Gavin Hunter. I'm an advisory consultant at SailPoint. My focus is really around identity security. And so I work with clients helping them adopt best practices and such as utilizing technologies like machine learning and automated access controls that enforce a least privilege model. And a lot of organizations are really struggling with this. And so especially with the remote workforce today, really hasn't made anything easier for them. So I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion, and I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you, Kevin. Prakash.
Hi, Prakash Nagpal with Apaegis. I am responsible for what I like to call customer conversations at Apaegis. My job is understanding customer challenges and aligning our products and our message to make sure we're addressing customer challenges. I've been in the security industry for about 15 plus years. Looking forward to the discussion with this August panel.
Thank you, Prakash. James.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. James Christiansen. I'm a vice president here at Netskope. If you're not familiar with Netskope, we secure the cloud. We provide security for DLP, SWIG, et cetera. And I'm a 25-year practitioner CISO for companies like Visa, General Motors, Experian as their first CISO in the industry. So happy to be here at the panel. It's an exciting topic.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. And last but not least, Tommy.
Yeah, Tommy Todd, Vice President of Security here at Code 42. We focus on insider risk management and provide a leading solution in that area. My background is similar to my colleagues here, 20 plus years in cybersecurity, focused primarily on data protection and data privacy, and happy to be a part of the panel.
Thank you, Tommy. Paul, I'd like to start with you. The question is, as more and more employees are now choosing to be remote versus coming back to the traditional office, how can organizations go about quantifying the risk that this now poses?
I think there's 4 points to consider when you're trying to assess the risk of a remote employee. One is the actual, the internet connection that they're working from, specifically the routers that they might have, often coming from their internet service provider. Those can be a major, point of exposure, being compromised either through weak passwords, vulnerable firmware, things like that. And then, of course, that can serve as an access vector to get to either their traffic or their devices themselves. Which brings me to the second point of exposure. What devices are they using? Are they using a company issued phone or a laptop that has network security monitoring and is compliant with corporate security policies, or are they just using a personal device that maybe is not getting security patches, doesn't have endpoint security support, and so on? So that's another risk factor as well. Third risk factor is what sort of remote access services are they using to get access to company infrastructure? Are they using RDP? Are they using VPNs? We've seen that one side effect of the pandemic and the rise of the remote workforce is the increased targeting of RDP services in particular. Specifically, a lot of ransomware actors in particular have now made this a fairly standard procedure to get into company infrastructures to use RDP services. And with so many people working from home, that just gives them more attack surface to work with. And then now conversely, if you're using VPNs, you gotta ask yourself, well, what are you doing to protect those VPNs? Are you making sure that the software is being updated regularly? Are you making sure that users have the proper education to configure the VPN connection properly, things like that. And then the fourth risk factor is how are they communicating with other remote employees using things like Slack and Zoom and so on. I think we've seen some examples recently. I think even the EA breach last year, and then according to some of the most recent reports, the breach of Okta might have involved some Slack credentials that were compromised and used to social engineer some of the technical support people. So do platforms like Slack and Zoom just create more opportunities for attackers to go after your employees? These are, I think, sort of that this is that, imagine a square or a diamond, and these are the 4 points you need to look at as you're assessing that level of risk.
Fantastic. Yeah, certainly. Gavin, I want to get your perspective in the space with the risk that this poses now.
Absolutely. You know, Paul mentioned a lot of ways in which to secure access. And what about the identities, however, accessing those resources? And that's really kind of my perspective. And gone are the days when our assets were protected by the network perimeter. With remote workforce using personal devices coming from everywhere, we must put a firewall around the identity itself. Because no matter how securely or locked up your resources are, a misconfigured organization or an orphaned account can open the door for a hacker to gain access. A real world example is a customer that I just had, a client that I had that spent the last 3 years recovering from a breach due to an orphaned account. Essentially, that's when HR terminates an employee, but one of their system accounts remains active. Consequently, it was compromised by an attacker who had access for 3 weeks in their systems before anyone noticed. So this is just one example of why it's so important to establish strong practices around identity management and security. It's, you know, building a solid program means automating the identity lifecycle, enforcing least privilege using roles and dynamic policy logic, and to continuously monitor the environment to adapt to changes in threats as things change.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gavin. Prakash, your perspective here?
It's interesting. You know, some of the points were covered by Paul and Gavin, but I'll characterize them slightly differently. Right? I think there are four, like Paul, I think there are 4 elements of risk, and those 4 elements are the device, the identity, the permissions, and the policy. And Gavin touched on some of the permissions, right? Devices, like both the speakers mentioned, people are going to use devices no matter as much controls as the organizations like to put in place. The current nature of using cloud and SaaS applications, devices are going to proliferate. So how do you assess how you're going to protect managed or unmanaged devices? You might not protect the device, but how do you protect the access from that device into the corporate resources? Identity. How do you make sure that the identity, Gavin is Gavin on, you know, a SaaS application, on the cloud platform, on the infrastructure, and everywhere together? The third element is permissions. Gavin touched on this too. How do you make sure that what Gavin is authorized to access today is the same that Gavin needs to be authorized tomorrow and the day after, and that the level of access that was granted at the beginning of the pandemic, right, which was, Gavin, just take this and get your job done. Let's just turn everything on. How do you make sure you monitor and control that better now that people are returning back to the office? And the fourth element, sort of adjunct to that, is this notion of a network, right? You were granted, both Gavin and Paul touched on VPNs. VPNs were built to grant you this broad access to the network and then do whatever you want. Our world has changed. We've moved from a network-centric world to an application-centric world and a cloud-centric world. How do you reconcile this broad access with the more finite controlled access to specific applications, specific resources, specific tasks and resources, and making sure you continuously monitor across these 4 risks to make sure that what was, as business changes and evolves and at the speed at which is evolving today, you can manage that risk continuously and monitor it continuously. So that's what I think people should be thinking about as they come back.
Fantastic. Thank you, Prakash. James, I wanted to get your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. You know, when I appreciate Paul, Gavin, and Prakesh's comments on, the really detailed things. I'm gonna just step it up a little. Really just thinking about it from a strategic perspective. And when you stop and think about how things have changed, our current security architectures were built on an environment where we had data centers and we had people working in the data in our offices on our land. Well, that's all changed now with the cloud and work from everywhere. I mean, those are dramatic changes in how we have to attack these new problems and look at them and the strategies we should use here. Risk is typically, likelihood times impact, right? Or a function of those. I don't like the times kind of factor, and as we look at that, we're trying to think about the risk. I try to, when I go in and I'm looking at a new organization, I'll stop and think, what are the 3 R's? And 3 R's are, how do we what makes us rich? What secret sauce do we have, whether it be an IP product, a retail, a process, what makes this company rich? Point A. What would ruin us? Second R, what would ruin us? Would a breach ruin us? Would a loss of IP ruin us? What would actually cause this company, grief, harm? Then thirdly, what are the regulations? What regulations do we comply with? And that really informs me on what I need to do as far as managing the risk of this environment, whether it be at home or what's more likely for the foreseeable future is a hybrid mode, where we got people in the office, got people at home, we're working in data centers, we're working in cloud. And as we stop and think about that, the first thing you've got to understand, though, is where are your gold nuggets, which those 3 R's should be telling you what's really important to you. What do you need to manage the risk around? One of the things you run into as you start to move into this new world of cloud and work from everywhere is gaining visibility. You can't manage what you don't know about. So as we move more and more to the cloud, we start to lose that visibility. We need to regain that visibility and be able to put the controls around that. And then thirdly, and I think it was Prakesh just mentioned VPN, and really moving now away from a zero trust model, which we've had for about the last 10 years, where we thought about identity and how we manage them when they're offsite and MFA, really moving now towards more of a continuous adaptive trust. And I'll talk a little bit later, probably in our program, about what do I mean about adaptive trust? But I think that's the way we have to start moving our security strategies to manage these risks that both Paul and Gavin and Prakesh did a great job of outlining.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. That's a great perspective. I like the 3R review there. Prakash, I want to pull on one of the threads that you'd mentioned in one of the 4 elements that you provided, and that's policy. So what security policies and necessarily practices your companies put in place to avoid employees falling victim to, say, a phishing scheme or ransomware attacks?
I think James also touched on this, right? The policy piece needs to account for the change in infrastructure. McKinsey had this quote of our digital transformation of the next 10 years is going to get accelerated and put into the next 6 months at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, whether you believe those numbers or not, whether 10 years got accelerated in 6 months, it kind of doesn't matter. What matters is this accelerated very significantly, and our world changed. Initially, the focus was just get everybody up and running, get them working. It's time to reassess that, right? And so it's really important to understand how you're going to marry what existed before in this pre-digitally transformed world and this new world, right? Again, not to rehash, but this network-centric and cloud-centric and application-centric world, the policies need to, one, address the two. The second point that James touched on is zero trust can't mean I did it once and moved on. It's about continuously monitoring, making sure that the controls that you put in place are indeed in play, are continue to stay in place, because your policies need to change as your business changes, as your business needs change, as you add new applications, as your users change, they move from one location to the other. So it's one part to define policies, is another part to continue to monitor and tune those policies. And the answer to the policy question also bleeds into, practices that you put in place, right? You can't just rely on people to do the quote unquote right thing, because, humans are fallible, right? At least I can speak for myself. I am. The rest of the panel, you guys are infallible, but I think there's a lot of people like me that are fallible. So how do you put technology in place to make sure that the policy intent is maintained, right? That's about continuously monitoring and refining. And when you find gaps in the policy, which can only come by monitoring continuously, you go back, revisit, and change the policy so that you can adhere to the business goals, right? And this cannot be, let me go check once every 7 months to make sure I'm in compliance, right? And when I say compliance, I don't mean just from a regulatory standpoint, but compliance of my business needs.
Exactly. No, that's a great point, Prakash. And really speaking then to infallibility, most insider threat attacks are actually not malicious. So Tommy, one of the things that I want to ask you is, how can employees effectively educate their employees on good cyber hygiene to minimize the risk of non-malicious employees who may be vulnerable to cyber attack?
Yeah, and that's something that we've noticed a lot of organizations are starting to put emphasis on, as the education and awareness component associated to cybersecurity training. And one of the things that a lot of places have come to realize is that it's not enough just to do point-in-time training. Every 6 months, every 90 days type training. It's not consistent enough for people to retain that type of information. So what we're actually advocating for is what we consider a micro training moment, where when an incident is generated, because as we've mentioned before, humans are fallible, right? We all make mistakes. We all have errors, not only in judgment, just through the types of technologies that we now have access to. Sometimes we make mistakes. So when those moments occur, if you're able to have timely education in the moment, where maybe you've got a 1 or 2 minute video that explains, hey, here's what you did, here's what you need to do moving forward. It actually resonates a lot better with employees. Not only is it a soft response, a non-punitive way to address an incident that might be non-malicious in nature, but it also helps cut down on what we consider repeat offenders. People that consistently make mistakes for one reason or another. When they're educated in the moment, they use better judgment moving forward. And we actually see a massive reduction in the number of repeat offenders over time as a result of this capability. The other thing that we get from a cyber security practitioner perspective is we now have accountability. Users are no longer allowed to hide behind the "I didn't know" excuse, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that was the case," because they've been educated and they have an attestation that aligns to that says, yeah, I've received the video, I've received the micro training, I now know what to do in the future. If I continue to make those mistakes, now we have a different kind of conversation, because you should know better at this point. So that micro training in the moment is critical when it comes to instituting a proper, insider risk management style program. And it's something that a lot of technology vendors are now starting to adapt as part of their offering.
Fantastic. Thank you. James, I want to get your perspective on this question as well. James, you're on mute.
Yeah, well, let me try that again. Take 2. Hey, Tommy, I really appreciate that thought about in the moment training. I couldn't agree more. That's really important. The yearly annual training is sort of like a checkbox thing. Not really effective. 10 minutes later, they forgot everything, right? But if you can give them that in the moment training, hey, what you're about to do is high risk. Here's a better way to do it. Here's our corporate provided solution. Ideal. And when you think about the malicious insider, the insider itself, I've run investigations in all those companies that I talked about earlier. I've done a lot of insider investigations. Well, the first thing you have to know is the numbers you read are just a portion of what actually happens. As I've worked a number of cases, I know my colleagues have as well, where it's an insider that's doing fraud. Well, it's not required under disclosure law to disclose it. So a lot of companies won't disclose those kind of insider attacks. And when you look at the insider, the non-malicious, that's just a human error. And we know from like a Verizon report, then human error is the #1 cause of security breaches or security events, right? So it's a really important topic to talk about. We could spend the whole session just talking about insiders and insider threats, but especially right now, we've all heard of the Great Resignation. I wanted to participate, but I can't. My wife won't let me in the Great Resignation. But it is real. And what we find in our stats is people start downloading about a week or so before they're going to resign, tremendous, 300 times the amount of data they downloaded previously. So you'll start to see these user behaviors. So you can start seeing it. They're non-malicious. They're just downloading, they're packing, getting ready to leave, but they're taking sensitive information. They're taking intellectual property. So we need to think about that. And that's even gotten worse. Have you heard of the gig economy? At RSA this year, I did a talk on the gig economy, and it's a new type of insider called the gig worker. And in there, I review a business case about Bob. Bob is this application programmer. He actually outsources his entire job for 2 different companies, making over 7 figures per company to China. He actually just log in the morning, see what the assignment was. They would work during the day. He'd check in the code that evening, et cetera. And they finally, the one company noticed the traffic going to China and said, what's this about? He had MFA, by the way, and he even sent his token to China for him. So it was quite hilarious. But in the end, the guy said, well, we hated firing him because he actually wrote the best code there was coming through. So, but this is real. People are at home, they're working gigs now. 90% of Americans said they would work another gig while at home. So does that create a threat? Yes, because you can start getting mixed IP. Why should I write that whole routine again? I just wrote it for this company. Let me just take that and make myself more productive over here. And that's a loss of IP. That's real investment. So we got to think about this. I'm going to tell you, though, the number one tip I'll give you around doing an insider threat program or insider risk is really around creating a culture. I'll say it again. It's around creating a culture that the employees feel comfortable. If they see something that doesn't make sense, they'll report it, knowing that they won't get somebody in trouble. If there's not anything, they won't get in trouble. It's if you see something, say something. The biggest events I've worked at the insider is somebody just noticing something didn't quite look like. My IPS, my IDS, DLP didn't pick it up because it was mostly a fraud case and they were just doing fraudulent activities. So create a culture that your employees feel comfortable reporting something that just doesn't look right.
Fantastic. Great advice. Great advice. Prakash, any thoughts here?
It's Tommy talked about this micro training, right? I'll give you an anecdote. My wife works for a company. The company shall go unstated, where they send out pretend phishing emails to all the employees, and if you click on the phishing email, you are required to go through another mandatory training. If you do it more than once, your entire team needs to go through mandatory training. Now talk about reinforcing the type of behavior. If you get called out in front of your colleagues for doing something, so everybody is hypersensitive. I spent decades telling my wife, don't click on emails, but now she's like, do you realize you should not be clicking on emails? It's a great way. These micro trainings are actually a great way to reinforce what you should do. I think the corollary to that is having the data to show people the continuous visibility on this action led to this outcome is a lot more powerful than sending them to, why don't you go read up about how your password should not be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Just jumping in real quick, the problem with that link thing, Prakash, is next day HR sends out a link saying, please click here to update your profile or something. So we've really got a mixed message we're giving our employees. Don't click links, do click links.
Right. The method of delivery also. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting paradigm. It makes it then harder to make good decisions, right? Because we're tainting the training, as it were, with these ideas, thoughts, and then practices that we say not to do, but then internally we use as a method of communication. That's very important. Thank you, James. Very good. Gavin, speaking of bad habits, what can be done to avoid employees bringing bad cyber habits that they've developed in over 2 years of necessarily in the remote space back to the office? What can we do in that space?
It's an interesting question. And when I think about bad habits, boy, that can be a big topic. But the truth of the matter is, we now have a hybrid workforce. People will continue to work from home as they also continue to work in the offices. So we have to really address bad habits in general. And one of the bad habits that I often see is new clients is what I call account mirroring. In other words, Tim is starting a new job today and his access has to look like Joe's. Well, that might make sense at first because, they're in the same department, they have the same manager. But what happens when Tim changes teams or joins a special project? Now, all of a sudden, Tim needs more access, and new responsibilities bring that new access. And so now his access looks very different than Joe's. And that this problem continues to exasperate itself when you look across the organization and you see this happening across the board. You can really see how this can get out of hand. And so really sort of adopting a best practice using role-based access and a properly configured access management system will really help eliminate this problem and avoid those types of bad habits.
Fantastic. That's great. That's salient elements there, no question. Prakash, your thoughts in this space as well?
Yeah, you know, I talked about human infallibility, and like James said, right, sometimes there are mixed messages. I think one of the ways you can't eliminate bad habits. You know, I've tried for God knows as long as I've been alive, I can't eliminate mine, right? So how do you put technology and controls in place to help alleviate the impact of bad habits? I think that's the key for organizations, right? What can you do? Now, look, the notion of 100% protection is fantasy. As all of us, even though we're vendors trying to sell companies, you know, cybersecurity software, nobody believes that 100% protection is possible. The question is, how do you identify gaps? And I think identifying gaps is about continuously monitoring. How do you mitigate the gaps? How do you put technologies in place? So one of the examples that I was talking about was, how do you put technology in place that can mitigate or prevent the spread of malware from these unmanaged devices onto your network? Because unmanaged devices are going to connect to your network. You know, as many controls as you want to put in place, there are going to be some devices that are going to connect. How do you put the technology in place? How do you, I know James talked about, hey, zero trust is old, it's adaptive trust, but I think the pure zero trust is not about a one-time activity, it's about continuously maintaining that zero trust. And the only way to do that is, again, continuous refinement. Continuous refinement, if it's manual, is not going to be possible. It's got to be in some fashion automated. And so I think the goal can't be, let's eliminate bad habits, let's try to put the controls in place to mitigate the impact of the bad habits.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, the technical controls and management of that, very important for building that type of capability. Because to your point is, it's not about getting rid of the bad habits, because like you say, we all have them and they're kind of inherent, but being able to control them in a form or fashion that allows us to get that best practice in play is pretty important there. Fantastic. Thank you, Prakash. Tommy, wanted to get your thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It is an interesting dilemma, because I know when we first started on this journey of going remote, there was a lot of upheaval around how do we act, how do we behave, what kind of things do we need to deal with, especially people that have never worked from home before. Now we're on the opposite side of that, where people are coming back into the office after being remote for a couple of years. And I really think it comes down to two fundamental things, and technology plays a role in this. One is resetting expectations with your employees, right? Reminding them there's an acceptable use policy. Let's take another look at that. Remind them of the employee handbook, right? You're coming back into an office, into a formal setting. We need a reminder on, hey, what did you sign up for when you first started here? The second thing is behavioral changes. And the way I kind of put an analogy out there, I know a lot of law enforcement people, and when people started getting back on the road after working from home for so long, they got to a point where they weren't issuing tickets right away. What they were doing is reminding people, you're back on the roads, there's a certain protocol, certain effort you need to put involved. So they're giving more warnings than they were actual tickets. And I think when we leverage technology in the way that we need to, we can be very aggressive with providing deeper visibility, understanding their behaviors that they're bringing into the organization. But as we respond to that, we need to consider not being punitive in our response. You know, kind of nudging the user, saying, we're aware of what you're doing some things incorrectly. Let's establish a micro training to get you back into the swing of things, and then ratchet up your response based on accountability and after you've done all that. So there's going to be an acclimation period that people are going to have to go through to get back into the office mode, and we need to kind of help them along with that process. But we need to take a humanistic stance behind that, right? We need to look at this as like, we're going to make more mistakes right up front, but over time, as we continue to combine education and we bring awareness to our audience, that risk will start to reduce on its own. People get back into the motions of what they're used to. You know, we've gone so far without having to rely on perimeter technologies, because we've been relying on the endpoint for the last 2 years, being that last bastion of defense. And as a result of that, there's actually been a cultural shift in the way security approaches it. We're looking at the human side of it, creating that human firewall, because we can't take advantage of all these perimeter controls we've had. Well, now that we're coming back into the office, now we can. So we're relying a little less on the human and more on, okay, how can we have our technical controls be involved in this visibility aspect? So it's going to be an interesting challenge to see as we do this RTO thing full swing, how people adapt to that. But my message is really just remember, we're going to make mistakes right up front. Be okay with that, but be aware of it, right? So that's where the visibility comes into play.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's time and some dedication. I think the micro training element as well adds capability that we should be preparing for now, as it seems we're moving back to an element of normality as we move forward. Thank you, Tommy. I appreciate that. James, I want to talk about the fact that organizations are now realizing they have an insider risk, insider threat problem, but few have mature programs or necessarily dedicated resources to that underlying threat or risk. What advice would you give to an organization who are just getting started with building an insider risk or insider threat program?
Yeah, no, great question, Sean. Again, this is such an important topic we're covering. And Tommy, first of all, I would like to run into the police officer and give me a warning. They always give me tickets. Always give me a ticket. Can you send them out this way for us? So when we think about establishing an insider risk program, I mean, first of all, you have to understand what a core part of your security program this is, because that's your number one threat. So as you unwind that a little bit, your first goal, remember the most common insider is that non-malicious. It's not telling them they can't do something, putting the guardrails. Why do we put guardrails along the roads? And so if somebody veers off a little bit, they won't get injured, right? We got to do that same thing, take that sort of approach as, all right, we're gonna kind of help you stay in line. So like the whole click thing, we tell people don't click, do click. When they click, we got to protect them. That bad things don't happen when they actually do click, because we're telling them to click all the time. So as we start to think about that, and we think about the fact we've got these huge cases and a lot of them are fraud, we really need to turn back to, I mean, I like kill chain analysis. I'll look at a kill chain analysis, and if you haven't reviewed that, I really suggest you do. And you look at each stage and say, okay, at each stage of this chain, what protections, what guardrails can I put in place to detect, deter, and recover from that insider, right? And as you start to lay that out, establish that framework. Now, I like the FAIR when I'm thinking about risk measurement, but there's also ISO 3001 or COBIT IT. It's that framework you can start looking at, do this. And there's a lot of good documentation on just what an insider risk program looks like. But again, you got to get visibility first. If you don't have visibility of what they're doing, you can't manage it. So that user behavior analytics will start giving you some both sides, the malicious and the non-malicious insider, and just putting that culture in place that allows people to report something, see something, say something.
Absolutely. No, thank you, James. Tommy, I want to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I want to expand on something James just mentioned about the visibility aspect. And I think when we think of things like insider threat versus insider risk, generally speaking, insider threat is kind of a wheel with a lot of spokes. And then data is just one of those spokes. A lot of times when I'm talking insider threat with organizations, especially financial, they'll mention, no, we look at fraud, we look at mental health, we look at social media presence, we look at all kinds of different things beyond just the data. But in the context of this conversation, when we talk about the visibility around the data, I think insider risk specifically needs to start from an acknowledgement that you have to consider all data. You have to take it all into account, not just specific data sets. Too often people get wrapped around the axle around intellectual property or PCI or PII. The reality is all of the data that's created in your organization has value. And so when you think of it in terms of insider risk, that's how you have to apply some of that logic. So acknowledging that up front is probably the first step in the right direction of instituting an IRM program. And then just recognizing it is a people, process, technology approach. Tech can get you so far, but you need to have a culture around process and around your people that help align to what you try to achieve with IRM. So it really starts in taking stock in what you have today culturally versus people, process, and what kind of technology you might have. And you might have to rethink the tech stack. You might have to say, yep, this worked for us prior to the pandemic, but it's not going to work for us moving forward. Maybe we need to reconsider some investments. And it is a big challenge, and it is a program. I like to point out to organizations that this is not a product. This is not a tool. It is a program that you have to consider. It's a living being that you're going to have to deal with from day one once you start to institute this. But the goal is to reduce your risk exposure over time and get to that state where you know where your data is going, and you know without a shadow of a doubt what's happening with your data, so that you can respond confidently and appropriately when you have incidents in your environment. So it's a much bigger challenge, and unfortunately I'm able to answer in a couple minutes, but it is definitely a strategy, and that's kind of how I try to advocate for it. So.
Oh, absolutely. No, thank you, Tommy. It's continuous, right? You're not going to get it right first, but over time, as you iterate and provide context and management in that respect, it becomes a way to create that capability. And it's also, as the data and the element of the business value changes over time, that also changes response in terms of that underlying threat that needs to be considered as part of the program as well. So it's, like you say, it's not set it and forget it. It's a continuous program. Thank you, Tommy. I appreciate that. Paul, question here is, does multi-factor authentication eliminate the risk posed by employees using personal devices for work? And if MFA is set up, is privileged access management still necessary?
MFA is a very good and very important line of defense, but it is not a silver bullet. I would say there are no silver bullets in cybersecurity, but this is still such an important thing that definitely is not something to overlook. There's two questions to ask as for how robust your MFA implementation is. First, are you doing it through SMS text messages, or are you doing it on either a mobile app or a hardware token? Doing it through text messages is vulnerable specifically to SIM swapping attacks, where an attacker will hijack the phone number of the user and thus receive the two-factor authentication codes that are meant for the legitimate user. So if you do it through a mobile authenticator app or a hardware token, it is not vulnerable to those types of attacks. Now, the other issue is, what device are you using to receive it? Particularly if you're using it on mobile, because if the mobile device that you're using to receive the two-factor authentication codes from a mobile authenticator app is not secure, then your MFA is not secure. And in fact, there are specifically Android malware families that specifically target two-factor authentication codes from the common authenticator apps like Google and so on. Now, most of these are designed to be banking Trojans, but certainly they could be repurposed for other types of attacks. And this gets into that broader issue of our employees using personal mobile devices. And if so, what, if any, kind of security support are they getting? Obviously, Android having some vulnerability issues. So having a good mobile device management solution for those is something to think about, just to make sure that you don't self-defeat one of your most important security measures.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Kevin, wanted to get your thoughts as well in this space.
Yeah, I think that no doubt MFA is essential for, and it's going to help any organization strengthen their security stance. But as Paul just mentioned, there's no silver bullet. And he just mentioned several ways that attackers can find their ways past MFA. So I always kind of say it's a good door lock, but doors can be kicked in. So it's critical that access management is utilized, because that will mitigate the damage if unauthorized access does happen. So access management not only limits what someone can do once they're inside, but also assures that the right people have the right access and nothing more. As an example of this, I had a client that I was just working with recently, and we discovered that they had 28 domain admins in Active Directory that were not in IT. And what's worse is that no one knew how they had this access, or how they got this access, or who granted this access. So now that's 28 more opportunities that an attacker has to breach one of these admin accounts. But it's not just the privileged access that needs to be protected. It's really all access across the environment. So access management then will govern what someone can do once they're through the door. What can they see? What can they access? basically it governs what they can do once they get past the MFA and limits, hopefully, the damage that they can do.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gavin and Paul, for that. James, I want to finish off with this question. How do you determine which company data and infrastructure is most important to protect, and who should have access to these sensitive items?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when you look at data and infrastructure, because again, we've proliferated so much with business digitalization and shadow IT before that is what we called it. The proliferation of data is everywhere. I mean, it's absolutely exploded where the data. I mean, we've created, there's a data explosion. I mean, we've created more data in the last year than our last 2 years than all of history before. So that's the kind of stats you're seeing. That's how much data this explosion. So understanding where it is, again, what data do you care about? What is your golden nuggets I talked about a little bit ago, and saying, I need to know where that data is. So you need to scan your data at rest and your data in motion. So whether that's in your infrastructure or out in your cloud, and getting that visibility where that data is. And then understanding, like just before in the prior question, we were talking about personal devices. Because as you start to think about protecting this data, well, maybe I'll let them access it. And this is adaptive trust. And this is how moving from zero trust to adaptive trust says, okay, I'm okay with an MFA if they're going to read that data, but if they're going to write it, I need to know more. I need to know more about them. I need more data elements. So we've got device risk. Are they on a personal device or a managed device? Are they using an application that's sanctioned, one that we know about, like maybe Office 365? Are they using ZippyShare to store that data? Because that's got to be part of the equation. Are they in a location? Are they coming from a bad location or sending the data to a different location? Looking at these different, I'll call them telemetries. Then you can say, now I can be more granular, more smart about the decision of what kind of access I'm going to allow. On that personal device, maybe I'll let them update it in place in Office, but I won't let them download it, versus just saying no, which is what I used to have to do. So shifting to an adaptive trust model. Okay, I know who you are. Now, we also used to say trust but verify. But nowadays, you've got to verify, then trust. So using this telemetry, you can get a better idea of what they're doing, what kind of risks you pose, and who are they. And using that to really understand and grant the access further. Because our goal as security leaders is to get them to access the data they need it, when they need it, and where they need it. Well, the more I can be granular, I can make better decisions about that risk, the further I can enable the business to go there. So this third-party access or third-party environments in the cloud, take all those things into account, use that telemetry to make smarter risk decisions and enable the business.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, that brings a conclusion to our panel today. I wish we had more time. Again, some great insights. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you, San Diego. Thank you, Cybersecurity Summit Bradford and all the team. And to the attendees, both virtual and in person, I want to make a recommendation. For the companies that are represented here today, please visit the virtual booth or the physical booth and see how these organizations can help you in your cybersecurity journey. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and much appreciated. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good seeing everybody.
Thank you.